Every morning, thousands of people are voluntarily standing under freezing cold water, convinced it's making them superhuman. Dr. Owen, is this actually true? Or have we all been peer pressured by men with podcasts?
Says man with podcast.
Hmm. Here's my confession. I do this every morning. I don't fully understand why. It hasn't gotten any easier. It's never fun in the moment, but something keeps pulling me back. So, Owen, please tell me whether I'm actually doing something good for myself or whether I've just become one of those people.
Yeah. Okay. So we can get into that for sure. And at the end of doing a deep dive on the data around this, we'll try and rate it somewhere on a scale from snake oil to genuinely legit. With evidence to back it up. But I think the most important thing we can do here is be specific. Of course, no, you're not literally becoming superhuman. None of us are. But what is it that we're actually specifically targeting? And it could be more than one thing when we decide to take this cold shower. And how can we measure for that? Can we do it directly? Is there some reasonable proxy, indirect thing that we can be tracking with, wearable data or something like that? There's a long list of potential benefits that are cited across the internet. But for specific things that I thought that we would cover today, would be the effect of a cold shower on mental health, specifically depressive symptoms, the capacity to do hard things, cognition and inflammation. Which of those, if any, are motivators for you, Sam?
Mate, to be honest, for me, it's just waking up in the morning. So let's say cognition and mental health.
Fair enough. So the first one we'll cover off on is mental health. And so I think, where would you go looking for information on this? What I would say is when we're thinking about getting good quality data online, we need to do a couple of things. One, not let our own preconceived ideas become the tail that's going to wag the dog. By that, I mean, don't search out only positive news stories and studies that affirm our beliefs or desires. Instead, you're using neutral search terms to bring you close to the truth and using platforms like PubMed or Google Scholar rather than TikTok. And the second thing we need to do is align ourselves with the correct incentives. The right incentives in this case would be listening to sources that are incentivized to be as accurate and truthful as possible, not as flamboyant as possible or as bold as possible or as widely shared as possible. So this means looking for peer-reviewed academic papers over influencers because a researcher's livelihood lives and dies on how rigorous their pursuit of truth is as assessed by a jury of their peers. If they're pumping out bogus misinformation, then they just won't attract further funding to keep doing their studies, hopefully, if the mechanism works. Whereas an influencer lives or dies off of how many views they obtain and therefore how much advertising revenue they generate. So they're going to go for whatever is most engage worthy and bingeable, essentially. So we've got to lean against that tendency to maybe enjoy ourselves and be a bit hedonistic and instead go wading into sort of more boring domains online, looking at researchers and trusted resources, again, like I've said, that are being judged on their factfulness, not their bingeability. So two resources that I think are good and a little bit less stale than PubMed or Google Scholar are examine.com and the Australian Institute for Sport website. So the former is a subscription and paid service, but they do have some free articles where they do deep dives on the data behind all the stuff that's kind of interesting to you and me. So like the effects of all these various online trends. So like taping the mouth when you go to sleep or it's cold water immersions. And the latter, the Australian Institute for Sport, do really great sort of deep dives on supplements. And they're really interesting and really packaged in a nice way that makes them quite palatable. And anyway, the reason why I brought up examine.com is they've got this page on cold immersion for depression. And what becomes immediately clear, just as if when you punch in cold shower and depression in PubMed, is basically there are no studies that look at this. And I think the reason why is because these studies that are taking place tend to be really small. They tend to not have many participants or run for very long. So they do want to try and figure out as fast as possible whether there is an effect of being really cold on your mood. So they tend to do quite long cold plunges in a cold bath rather than in the shower. So we find ourselves quite quickly comparing apples and oranges there. And the other thing that they do is they basically take very specific protocols that are really hard for you or I to apply at home. So, for example, when thinking about cold water and depression and exploring that on examine.com, one of the links that they share is to a pretty wild study about the effectiveness of whole body cryotherapy as an add-on to antidepressant medicines in depression. And so in the study, they took 92 medically stable adults with a diagnosis of a depressive episode and split them into two groups, one that were going to get the cold treatment and one that are getting the placebo. And they found that those getting the cold treatment had improved reported depressive symptoms on these depression checklist questionnaires after the treatment. But actually, when you kind of look into it a bit further, the cold treatment was 10 cryotherapy sessions at between minus 110 degrees Celsius and 160. But the other non-cryotherapy group were still having a minus 50 degree session. And so they found apparently there's a difference in reported depressive symptoms depending on whether you get frozen at minus 110 degrees or minus 50 degrees. This is the sort of data we're having to use if we try and follow, a robust research-led lens to figure out whether dunking yourself in the shower in the morning is going to alleviate your depressive symptoms. Or the opposite way of coming at it, which is probably the more popular one online, is to talk about plausible mechanisms of when I get in something cold, we know that on a cellular level, some hormones are being released. And then they'll make XYZ connection that, because you get some cortisol and adrenaline released, even though we think about those as things we should be trying to minimize and mitigate in other aspects of our lives. Therefore, hopefully, you can keep levels of those same hormones lower throughout the rest of the day. In the case of adrenaline or epinephrine and norepinephrine, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So we don't know what the effect is in the brain anyway, because we're using blood draws rather than a freaking needle in the head to get that information. So, clear as mud, unfortunately, on that one. But most people aren't getting cold enough to put themselves at much harm and duress. So really, I think sod the extremely limited data and go for what feels good for you.
Heck yeah.
Do you want to weigh in before we move on to the next one?
I'm a bit worried about how this is going to impact my cold showers because I'm certainly not going in at minus 110.
Well, you can't, can you? Because it wouldn't. You'd have frozen the pipes. You can't do it.
Yeah. I'm not even sure how that would look if I had been able to put myself over in minus whatever it is. Because I have to get into it and then let it freeze. No, thank you.
So reason number 2 for doing the cold showers that we're talking about today is that perceived sense of self-efficacy, or that taking a cold shower improves your capability and capacity to do hard things and unappealing things throughout the rest of your day. And so does this work? Is there any scientific evidence either way? No, basically that's not been studied. And I guess there are lots of reasons for that, but one of them is just there are so many confounding factors in what goes into your day, and it's pretty hard to weigh up the counterfactual of what stuff you would have not done had you not had the cold shower. But that is really the pertinent question. The pertinent question is not, can I transiently reduce my body temperature, or can I cause a surge of cortisol and adrenaline and then for it to come down when I warm up? Basically, those are not effective proxies or indicators for whether or not you'll go on to have a productive day doing things inclusive of hard things. So does it work? Well, I think the answer here is totally individual, and keeping a diary would really help, because it would basically contain the answer to the following question. Has my implementation of daily cold showers led me to achieve other hard things? Or do I just now suffer cold showers, but achieve exactly the same otherwise in my day?
Mm. At least psychologically, I feel like it's doing something, which feels like the point you're trying to make here is like, yeah, perhaps you can't really study this uh, uh, in like clinical trials, but on an individual level, I do feel I'm more ready to kind of like kick ass. Makes me sound way too American, but you know, ready to go for the day. So yeah, that's good. So it's more of a personal feeling then, really, as to whether it does help you or you feel like you are capable of doing hard things.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't find any robust trials that had, exposed one group to cold showers and one group to warm showers, and then, followed them through their days, and seen who was able to undertake hard things and who wasn't, or even presented them with a set of challenges and seen if one group had a better appetite to carry on and do them than the other. So yeah, just in this desert of scientific data, I think we have to be led here by basically what's effective for us. And the best way to figure that out is to try and measure it. And then that's okay if actually what you end up doing is you end up performing and doing hard things because you're measuring yourself. There's the Hawthorne effect in physics where subatomic particles were found to behave differently whether they're being watched or not. And the same thing is true of us humans. Like we are more complex and complicated, or perhaps the opposite. We're larger and more lumbering. But whether it's knowing that we're tracking ourselves or setting ourselves up to sort of stack wins on wins on wins by doing one hard thing to put us in the mindset that we can do multiple hard things, then, either way, do what you need to do the thing, really, isn't it? Yeah, know that sort of we're in a bit of a data desert there, but that is what it is. So moving on to the third reason, which is cognition. To this end, a short blast in the shower, again, basically hasn't been studied, but significant cold immersion has a lot. And then there are some studies that will provide the cognitive tasks to the study participants during the cold exposure and others after the cold exposure with a period of rewarming. And so basically we find that you can drop your core body temperature through cold water exposure, and that repeatedly this tends to actually reduce on standardized cognition tests our attention, our visual spatial awareness, our reaction speed across a broad battery of these tests. This does make quite a lot of sense when we consider that one of the ways that ice works to numb pain or reduce pain is by slowing sensory nerve conduction, and that heating up a nerve speeds up conduction, slowing it down reduces conduction, and our brain is a basket of interrelated neurons or nerve cells. So cold immersion actually slows our cognition. But maybe it's the sense of cognitive processing speed picking back up as we warm that makes us feel as if we have enhanced cognitive capacities. Because the difference in the studies really here is the studies that do a battery test of how your cognition is tend to report a decline in cognition with cold immersion. The studies that instead just ask people to review how their cognition feels, they report an increase in felt cognition after cold immersion. So perhaps we're sort of walking one way and talking the other way, and perhaps that's okay, given that most of us probably aren't taking full advantage of all of our cognitive capabilities to do the hard thing. It's usually just a matter of attention and priority. And the other thing is we're probably not dropping our core body temperature anywhere near as much as is being asked of the study participants in these extreme environments. And a lot of the studies have these confounders of like they're also being carried out at altitude, or there's also some other mad environmental restriction or hardship that we don't have at home.
Dude, two things there. Firstly, I'm not surprised. I'm like imagining Wim Hof, who just is all about like being immersed in cold water, and he just goes out swimming in like frozen lakes,
Yeah.
and how that he claims to like be able to control the heart rate and stuff like that, which is crazy. And maybe that's not for today's episode. But I was just thinking then, if I was to compare the the cold shower or like maybe let's talk about something more intense than that, like the immersion of our bodies like through like really really cold temperatures. you talk about like how your cognition drops and rises again, and how that feels like we might be getting like we may have a higher cognition. Is there, and that's basically only based on like our feeling. What's the crack with coffee? Does coffee actually increase our cognition, or is it again we just feel like because we've got more energy, we feel like we have better cognition? Or are we actually like does cognitive load actually increase when we drink something like coffee, or is it that's how we feel when we've had it?
Yeah, I think coffee tends to perform pretty well, actually, in task performance, not just in reported felt
Yeah,
sense of how good you are at doing the thing.
that makes
And I guess another thing to say with the cold immersion is actually like we do see, athletes competing in high temperature environments deliberately pre-cooling because again, we've got this homeostatic sweet spot of like temperatures at which our body's optimized to work. And when we deviate too far below or too far above, the wheels start coming off. So actually, a cold shower, if you work outdoors, if you are in a hot climate that's not AC controlled, like maybe there's some functionality there, but again, probably you're not going to stay in it long enough to get properly cold or to be able to apply the cooling, immediately close enough to the task. If you've got to then commute to work, probably you're going to be arriving at the same temperature either way. Yeah. And so another reason that people would be taking it, and the fourth reason would be doing the cold shower thing, would be to moderate inflammation. And, like icing a boxer's knuckles, we've known for a long time that cold is great at reducing inflammation. And we do get real observable, repeatable reductions in sort of blood markers for inflammation and inflammatory processes. So things like your CRP, your C-reactive protein, do tend to go down after strenuous exercise plus cold water immersion compared to not doing it. But again, a lot of these studies are quite cold and quite long compared to what most people are doing in the shower. And that's not to be dismissive of their efforts. Like it's hard to repeatedly subject yourself to cold showers. But the studies usually that are just trying to maximize the effect size to make sure that they can basically publish interesting sounding stuff that's not within the margin of potential error of just random chance. So they tend not to focus on a cold shower. So yeah, we do see that effect, but whether this matters to you probably sort of in large part depends on what levels of sort of bodily inflammation are going on for you, and whether this inflammation is part of a good or a bad process. Like on the one hand, there's a lot of thoughts and some research suggestive within the community of neurologists and psychiatrists that depression, or at least quite a lot of depressed people, are having a chronic inflammatory condition going on in the brain. On the other hand, we've got short-term acute inflammation like in DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness, and it's now come to be understood as an integral part of the hypertrophy or muscle rebuild and recovery process. So what was the first sort of study to shine light on the potentially damaging effects of cold through reduced inflammation was a 2011 study of rats, icing rats' muscles that had been deliberately bruised. Half of the rats in the samples after being pummeled got iced directly on the muscle, half of them didn't. And then they were all euthanized, asphyxiated because, well, lab animals, and then they were autopsied and they looked for what the muscle tissue was like, and they found that the ones that had been iced actually had increased levels of scar formation and reduced total muscle bulk. So it seemed that actually the ice here was blunting an important part of the healing process from the tenderizing of the muscle. And so this and subsequent work on humans in the gym has led to the general recommendation that post-exercise icing disrupts DOMS, but also hypertrophy. So if you're training to make adaptations and go on and compete later, then you shouldn't be icing as part of your protocol, and you should potentially avoid cold water because probably whatever temperature water you would be using hasn't been studied, and the duration you're doing hasn't been studied because the data is super limited. But cooling it down tends to be a good analgesia. It tends to be good if you need to turn around and perform again the next day. If you're like a tennis player in a 2-week tournament, dunking in the ice bath seems pretty useful. But if you're trying to do the thing to make long-term adaptations and growth, it might well be getting in the way. Make sense?
Blimey, that does. Okay, I did not expect that one actually at all. I just thought it was common knowledge that, yeah, post-exercise icing is great all the time. I guess maybe that's just my Instagram feed that's telling me that, or maybe somebody's selling a cold plunge. Um, okay, I'm shocked, but also makes sense to why you may or may not do it. Because, like, as you say, like maybe if you trained for a big event, like let's say a high rocks or half marathon or whatever, like jumping in there after that, once you know that you're not in the motions of training for it, you just competed, and you're trying to reduce your DOMs for the following day. Then great, because you've got to go to work the next day. You got to like try and just focus on recovery. You're not focusing on adapting your body at that point. So that does make sense. Also great because it means I don't have to invest in a cold plunge or whatever to use between training sessions. Yeah, sweet. That makes sense, right?
So there's a few things that we've covered off on, but if we try and sort of like draw it down to its biology and its psychology, the biology is that cooling the body is stressful because our bodies are optimized to perform at and around that 37 degrees Celsius range, and they sort of begin to fall apart and dysfunction too far above and below it. So when we subject ourselves to a lot of cold, we shiver, we activate our brown fat or non-shivering thermogenesis, and we release and burn up a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, all to try and promote generation of heat to basically resist the effects of the cold. The question off the back of that is, does this spike of cortisol, adrenaline, and all this activity, does that yield overall reductions in these two pro-stress hormones across the period of the day? Is doing the hard thing making other things less hard? And I've not seen any compelling data either way, basically, of these hormones being measured with serial blood draws and samples throughout the day, and seeing whether actually over a 24-hour period your proxy markers for stress are lower overall or cumulatively. I don't know if the area under the curve has been reduced by doing it, or if we're just feeling better and just wearing it better. So yeah, I think that's where the psychology comes in is, are we affecting materially in any measurable way what's happening to our body 6, 12, 18 hours later? We haven't really got that much compelling data to say either way. But do we feel better about it? And the story we're telling ourselves about other hardships and challenges is a more positive one, where we feel more active and capable to, endure, overcome all that stuff. Even if that's all it is, then it's probably worth it for you. But then I guess the risk, you said it hasn't got easier for you getting into the cold shower. But if it does get easier for you, is it doing the hard thing, or is it the cold shower that's making things better for you moving forwards? Because if it's doing the hard thing, you might need to find another hard thing if you secretly start enjoying the shower.
Yeah. It's like having a warm shower. There's no difference whatsoever. All right. Wow. Well, thank you for diving deep on all of those. I'm going to put you on the spot here, though. For each of those 4 things, can you categorize whether a cold shower is snake oil, overhyped but harmless, solid but oversold, genuinely legit? We'll start with mental health first.
Yeah, so I think that it would be harsh to call it snake oil because it's not obviously bunk, but we just don't have any solid data. So I'm gonna put overhyped, but harmless, because none of the bugger all studies we have into cold exposure and mental health notice any severe decline in your mental health. So until we get better quality data, and unfortunately, I don't think it's coming because, well, unfortunately, you can't patent a cold shower. So who's going to fund it? Until we get better quality data, it's really hard to say that actually this will work for you and you and you in all these different circumstances. And this is the protocol that's been shown to be effective by people who are trying to run a rigorous study rather than peddle their own programs. So
Awesome.
yeah, overhyped, harmless. Time will tell, hopefully, but it hasn't at the moment.
What about capacity to do hard things?
I'm going to put this as solid but oversold, because actually this one, I guess we just don't need scientists and researchers to tell us whether or not it enhances our capacity to do hard things. Like, even if it is just anecdote, which is what it is, it's people saying, I subjected myself to cold and then I did this and this. That is doing hard things. We don't need to measure your blood markers for whether or not you're doing hard things. Like the proof basically is in the pudding, and the proof needs to be in your own pudding. If you can show through collecting data on your own performance that doing a cold shower as part of your morning routine makes you do, or is part of you doing more hard things, then it's legit for you.
Absolutely. I like that. Thank goodness. It kind of validates my own cold showers a little bit there. Okay. Third, does having a cold shower or cold plunge improve my cognition?
Yeah, so I'm going to say this one is unfortunately snake oil, which is to say, if we properly genuinely get cold, our cognition tends to decline, and that tends to be quite repeatable across a lot of studies. There was a systematic review that found that of 18 studies into cold water exposure for cognition, 15 of the 18 showed a decline in cognitive performance. And like I said, the ones that tend to go against the grain and go the other way are not the ones that measure it through a test. They're the ones that ask people to report how they feel that cognition is. But yeah, most people aren't getting cold enough that they're feeling sustained, prolonged, protracted effects, I would imagine.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. Gutted, but that makes total sense. Okay, final one. Does having a cold shower help me with inflammation?
Yeah, so I guess this one would be solid but oversold. Cold things, exposure to the cold does tend to reduce inflammation. Whether we're doing enough of it to move the needle in terms of long-term inflammation, for most of us, that's going to be something that's going untested. If we have a focal or local source of inflammation that's sort of deep down, the only way of, icing a deep injury would be to cool everything down a lot. So we're perhaps not cooling the right parts. If your, long-term inflammation is, I don't know, around the heart, have you effectively dropped the temperature there significantly? Probably not. Whereas if it's something superficial, I don't know, a stubbed toe, make it cold for long enough, then you will cool it down. And then the other part of that is the cooling effect and the reduction of the inflammation. Is that part of a chronic and sort of illness-provoking inflammatory process, or is it part of a short-term and necessary evil kind of DOMS type process? Because if it's the former, then doing what you can to stifle that is great. And if it's the latter, well, actually, you might be missing out on something you actually want by doing it.
Really solid, mate. Okay. We got a prescription for me? You don't have to.
Yeah. Keep doing it if your self-audit suggests that you're getting some bang for your buck and some benefit out of it. And yeah, just be aware of those blind spaces, also those potential downsides. If you're doing it after the gym, could you trial a short period of time without it and see if actually that was imposing a handbrake or causing you to plateau somewhere where you otherwise wouldn't? If the answer is no, it's not creating a plateau, then reintegrate it for all those other reasons that you would be enjoying it.
So my kind of personal take home from this is, if it feels good for me personally, then keep doing it. At least my use case, which is trying to wake up in the morning and try and engage my brain. It maybe doesn't make full sense from a medical science perspective, but for me personally, it feels good. And as you said earlier, I think you summed up very nicely. If I had enjoyed it, if I was starting to enjoy it, then perhaps I wouldn't be putting my body through a bunch of stress and having it wake up in the morning.
And how long are you showering for on cold?
Okay, I'll be completely honest here. I have a warm shower, then for the last 30 seconds, I'll just bosh it over to right as cold as it will go and stand in the thing. Which again, now makes me realize that I'm probably not letting my body temperature drop particularly low by doing that. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think also what's worth saying on the back of that, and hopefully we've stressed this point already, is that there's no peer-reviewed research looking at that protocol. And it's probably true of most of our protocols. no research group has, for most of our cases, most of the time, taken what we're doing and studied that. They've taken something around that we're having to sort of approximate to, just in the absence of a lot of well done research in the area.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. The rat story was interesting.
Mm,
Cool. All right. Is that the pod?
cool. That's the pod.
Be well, do good.
Nice.